There's a lot to consider when picking the right processor for your computer. And that's mainly because the processor is a really complex part of your computer. And in this video, we're going to talk about what you need to know about choosing a good processor for your PC. But really quick, this video is a part of a complete guide on how to build a custom PC, and the other videos in this series are helpful in understanding this video, so I'm going to link the playlist in the cards and in the description below so you can go watch those other videos. Now, the processor or the CPU is the first component that I recommend buying when building a computer, because which processor you get will influence pretty much every other component in your PC. And that makes it really important to know what your options are regarding CPUs and which ones are good. Now, there are essentially two major CPU manufacturers in the market, and they are Intel and AMD. There are other brands out there, but virtually every PC, Mac, or Chromebook you've ever owned or used runs on either an AMD or an Intel processor. So those are the two brands you're going to want to look at for purchasing a processor. Now, each brand releases new CPUs every year, and each set of releases is referred to as a generation. So for example, in 2021, Intel is releasing their 11th gen CPUs and AMD is releasing their 5th gen CPUs. And next year, Intel will release 12th generation, AMD 6th generation. As you can imagine, each generation is usually at least a little bit better than the previous generations. For a really long time, Intel was the top dog and everyone built with Intel processors. However, over the past few years, AMD has improved significantly, and now it's about as common to see an AMD-based computer as an Intel-based computer. And it seems to be trending that AMD is going to be outperforming Intel in the coming years. But for right now, both brands offer similar price to performance and compatibility. So both are good options. In my personal PC over here, I have an Intel-based processor, but for this series, I'm going to be using an AMD processor. In just a little bit, we're going to go to my computer and pick out that processor for this series, but before we do that, it's a good idea to know the naming conventions that AMD and Intel use. They both make a lot of different processors, so more or less they put their processors into buckets of categories or performance. If you're buying an Intel, those categories are going to be i3, i5, and i7. And if you're buying an AMD, those categories are going to be Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, and Ryzen 7. Now, there are other categories like Threadripper, Xeon, Celeron, Athlon, etc. But if you're building a PC for gaming or work, odds are it's going to be one of those aforementioned categories. Generally speaking, the categories go from lower performance to higher performance, from i3 to i7 or from Ryzen 3 to Ryzen 7, with the 7 being the higher performing category. There is some overlap between the categories, but that's the general rule of thumb. Now, the last thing to know about the naming conventions is that there is always a number that follows the first part of the title of the processor. And that number will tell you what generation the processor is. The next three numbers will then tell you about the performance of that processor, and then the letter at the end tells you if you have any special features on that processor. So for example, a popular CPU by AMD right now is a Ryzen 5 5600X. The Ryzen 5 tells us that the processor is a mid-range processor. The 5 in 5600 tells us it's a 5th generation CPU. 600 tells us that the processor is in the upper echelon of performance of the Ryzen 5 processors. And then the X tells us that the processor can be pushed beyond what other processors can do in that category. I hope that made sense. It can be really confusing because these are just 4 components of a lot that tell us about CPU performance. And so because it gets really, really complicated, let's just hop on over to the computer and I'll show you what I do to pick the CPU for when I build a PC. All right, so this is going to be a quick and dirty how I go about picking a CPU. There are definitely more scientific ways of going about it, but this is just a way that I think will get the job done, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to take you through my process here really quickly. First of all, I buy all of my parts from newegg.com. It's a really good marketplace for buying PC parts. So I'm going to come over here to components, and then I'm going to hover over CPUs and processors and click on desktop processors. And then I know that for this system, I want to be running AMD as my brand of choice. And so I'm going to come over here to the left and I am going to select AMD 5000 series because that's their most recent generation of processors. And then I'm also going to come over here to Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5, AMD Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5. And I'm just going to check all of those because even if we're looking at an older generation of processor, there could be some really good performance and probably some good deals in there too. So I don't want to discount them. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and this is going to give me my list of processors that I'm going to want to work from. Now the question is, there are a lot of reviews on all of these. A lot of them seem to be pretty good reviews. So the question is, which one do I buy? Is there any way to check performance? And there is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a different tab here, and instead of coming to components on Newegg, I'm going to look at computer systems. And then I'm going to click on, gaming desktops, and I'm going to click on best selling. Here we go. So, and then this best selling computer, I assume this is probably the last 30 to 90 days or whatever. This is the best selling gaming computer that they've sold. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. It's a $1,200 system. That is in our price range. A good gaming PC can range from about $800 to about $1,400, which is a pretty big range. And this falls into that range. And so I'm going to look at the CPU that these guys are running. And it looks like it's running on an Intel i7-10700F. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that. And then I'm going to come to a new tab, and I'm going to type in browser.geekbench.com. Geekbench it's like a database that has a bunch of benchmarks. People will run tests on their CPUs, and their results will be saved to Geekbench. So I'm going to go ahead and input that CPU into this search function and pull up the results for this CPU. So we have over 1,800 people have cataloged their results from testing this CPU, right? And you have two different scores that you're going to look at. You have single core performance. So each processor has different cores inside of it, and so you can test, the single core performance and then the multi-core performance to get an idea of how well it is. Or how good it functions. And it looks like we have somewhere in the ballpark of 1,200 for single core on average. And then it looks like on average, we're somewhere in the ballpark of 5,000 to 6,000, some going all the way up to 7,500. And so that gives us an idea that this is the kind of performance that we're looking at in terms of like decent performance on a gaming computer, is that 1,200 for single core, somewhere in the ballpark of 6,000 to 7,000 for multi-core. So we're going to come back over here to our AMD processors, and we're going to sort these ones by best selling. And I just want to see what most people are buying, right? It looks like the best selling for quite some time has been this Ryzen 5 3600. So I'm going to go ahead and input that into our Geekbench and see what kind of score that gives us. And it looks like this one is scoring right around the same territory, around 1,200 for single core, and then about 6,000 for multi-core, with some going up to 7,000, 7,500, some lower ones around 5,000. This one goes all the way up to 8,100. So this one looks like it's about on par. So I could buy this CPU for $220, but I want to see what else we have to offer. I have heard quite a bit about this one right here, this Ryzen 5 5600X, and this one is $80 more than the other CPU. So I am paying quite a bit more for this CPU, but I do want to check the performance on this one just in case. So this would bring the overall cost of our PC up, but let's take a look. And wow, so this one, it looks like our single core performance is somewhere in the ballpark of 1,600 to 1,700 on average. So that's a really, really high single core performance. And then our multi-core performance is 8,500 to, it looks like 9,500. Some of these scores being up in the 9,500 area. So it looks like this one, about 8,500 to 9,000 is what we're doing on average for this multi-core performance for this specific processor. So this one is a really, really good CPU. So I'm going to go ahead and add this one to my cart because this is the one that I want to be buying. And so that is a quick and dirty way of finding a good processor for your system. That took 3 to 5 minutes. And now I've got a really, really awesome CPU that I'm going to be putting inside my gaming computer. And that's how I do it. Like I said, there are more scientific ways to go about it, but this is the way I do it. All right, so we've covered a lot of information about picking a processor for your computer, but there's also a lot we didn't cover, like L2 and L3 cache, the effect that nanometers have in computing power and speed, clock speed, TDP, etc. These are all subjects that really only matter when you become really experienced with PC building. Like if you're a competitive gamer and every frame per second matters, or a professional video editor and every second of rendering time is a big deal. But the information in this video, with that you have enough to pick a processor that you know will fit your needs. But hey, I also don't know everything, so if you're not a beginner, if you've done this before and you made it to this point in the video, let me know your tips for picking a processor down below in the comments. If you found this video helpful, I'd love a thumbs up or a sub from you. And stick around because I'll be posting another video soon on how to pick a motherboard for your system. And if that's published already, I'll put that somewhere on this video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.